This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Okie dokie, are we ready to go ahead in this exciting, timeless moment of deep intellectual endeavour? We've got Bill Squire tonight. He's going to be talking about philanthropy in a sort of philosophical or anthropological way, plus with insights into philanthropy in terms of higher education. May I just say that we invite you all to stay after for copious amounts of wine, which you see how much we have. There's a target there, so be prepared to meet it. And also to sign the register when it comes around to you. That would be grand. Anything else? No. Okay, here we go.
My subject is philanthropy, but I have no special scholarly qualifications to address this topic. I'm reliant on my own experience and personal reflections, so I'm dependent on your understanding and patience in presenting some thoughts to you. Since this is a society devoted to the voluntary sector, I don't think I need to argue the case for the role of volunteers, particularly since the sector originally was totally dependent on philanthropy. And I think despite increased funding from governments, is likely to remain dependent, ideally, if only to preserve its own autonomy and some kind of independence from public bodies. But that's by the way. I just want to make the point that philanthropy is a complex subject. It's worth looking at some definitions. If you look it up in the OED, it's defined as love towards mankind, practical benevolence towards man in general, the disposition to promote the well-being of one's fellow men. Excuse the gender, I'm quoting the OED. It's a pretty wide definition. I usually think of a philanthropist as somebody who makes gifts, usually of money. So I looked at the OED definition of a gift, which is even more strange. In addition to the immediate meanings of a transfer of property or a natural endowment, it includes two further meanings: an offering to God or a heathen deity, something given to corrupt, a bribe. I think these definitions cover a wide spectrum from good to evil, and they imply not just a transaction but some kind of reciprocal response, concrete or emotional, from the act of giving. Gift is not a simple gift. I think these sets of relationships which a gift implies can be looked at from various angles, and I want to consider a number of aspects in the light of some historical and contemporary examples. In the first place, it's really about who gives, why they give, what they give to. Is there an ethical, what are the ethical constraints? What are the modern manifestations? Is this good for public policy? What is the impact on the body politic? Finally, is all this effort worthwhile? So if you take the first thing, who gives? We live in a cynical age. We no longer trust journalists, politicians, nor of course bankers. I don't know about academics. So the OED definition of people with a love for mankind who want to promote the well-being of mankind these days is prima facie suspect. Yet there's a widespread acceptance of the idea that those that have should give to those who have not. In the modern world, in some ways we shuffle off that individual responsibility in the concept of progressive taxation, the welfare state. But the idea of a duty to save life or relieve affliction, not just of our nearest and dearest, but also of our neighbour and even the distant stranger. So these questions, including the related questions of who is our neighbour and how distant do we count the stranger, are there any limits on our duty to help such folk, been widely discussed through the ages. Philosophers and theologians have argued over an individual's personal responsibility, whether it's entirely discharged by fulfilling one's duty to the state, to Caesar. The idea of an individual duty is widespread in time and space. But there are also limits to this duty, usually recognized as the point at which the act of giving imperils some equal moral imperative, such as one's own survival or the sacrifice of those for whom you are directly responsible. Those of you who read Dickens may remember Mrs. Jellyby from Bleak House. She fell on the wrong side of the voluntary worker, since her efforts to promote the settlement of 150 families on the banks of the River Niger came at the expense of total neglect of her household and her many children. Nevertheless, the duty of giving for charitable purposes is recognized by, for instance, all the major religions. An obligation to give for the relief of poverty and other pious acts is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. It's incumbent on all Buddhists to, quote, make merit, unquote, by giving alms to the young monks who circulate daily with begging bowls around the streets and the villages in Buddhist countries. There are similar injunctions in the Old and New Testament, so I think we can safely conclude that the answer to who gives is that everyone gives. There's a universal propensity to give. So why do people give? By definition, a philanthropic gift is altruistic. Social scientists and psychologists will tell us at once that there's no such thing. And they deduce from the historical and social record there's invariably a mixture of motives. Besides altruism, some most often cited, and I've written them down: gratitude, a reciprocal gift, a gift for a gift or service, social prestige, guilt, shame, penance, bribery. You might be able to add others. Some of these motivations are still relevant today, though one must hope that guilt, shame, penance, bribery are more readily found in the medieval period than in contemporary record. But there are many documented examples, pre the English Reformation, of endowment for chantries. Masses are said to shorten one's time in purgatory. And some of these endowments ultimately found their way into college endowments or hospital endowments. So this variety of motives, I think, still, I leave out the religious ones, largely apply today. But to restore your faith in humanity, I might cite one contemporary example, one modern British example, namely the National Blood Transfusion Service, where blood donors give their blood for free, unlike the United States, where you get paid if you give blood. Not only do you give it for nothing, but neither the donor nor the recipient know the other's identity. This is as near to altruism, you do get a cup of tea, of course, but it's as near to altruism as one can reasonably get, though it can be argued that the motivation, even in this case, is mixed. Any blood donor knows that he or she or a family member may have need of such services. I don't know if you're familiar with Richard Titmuss's book, The Gift Relationship, but he goes into some detail analysing the motives after conducting lots and lots of interviews. he analyses the motives. He had many tables illustrating the different motives which donors give for taking part in that service. Indeed, his discussion of the role of gifts in pre-industrial societies as well as industrial societies concludes, and I'm quoting him here, as I think it's a key quote, "The social relations set up by gift exchange are among the most powerful forces that bind society together." Well, although I'm speaking from my experience in the higher education sector, I think that's a pretty good statement of the role of voluntary agencies and of charities across the board. And we're getting close to a non-financial reason for supporting and encouraging philanthropy. Maybe we're coming to reverse the OECD definition of philanthropy and discovering that donors, in fact, are making gifts which serve the needs of society, including their own needs. Certainly the growth of the English universities will illustrate how utilitarian needs have benefited from philanthropic gifts. When I started at Cambridge, there was a strong academic feeling that utilitarian things were not the sort of thing you talked about in polite society, that they were there for higher things like the pursuit of truth. Well, the history of their own institutions is the reverse. Indeed, one authority has described the early growth of the English universities as institutional responses to the need to harness expanding intellectual forces of the 11th and 12th centuries, and I'm quoting here, to the ecclesiastical, governmental and professional requirements of society. Their essential purpose had been to augment the number of trained personnel to meet the demands of secular authorities, the church and the organised professions. Now, that's as utilitarian as you can get for the concept of a university. And I'm quoting Cobham from his book, The Medieval English Universities. In the medieval period, and Cambridge has a list of donors in the annual service of commemoration of benefactors going back to Eleanor of Aquitaine. So many donors in the medieval period make gifts from very different motives to fund this expansion. The reliance of medieval universities on private donations, as well as on funding from the church and the state, is paralleled in modern times. Most, if not all, the great civic universities of the 19th and early 20th century were financed initially by local philanthropists. You think of Bristol, Nottingham, Leeds, many others. And through gifts of land, buildings, as well as cash, public subscription from many levels of society. I found a quote by a Vice-Chancellor of Sheffield saying that the University of Sheffield was funded in part, quote, by penny donations made by working people in the city. And those of you who know the Birmingham campus will know there's a memorial to the local landowner in the centre of the campus who gave the land on which university was built. So civic pride and respect for learning can perhaps be added to the medieval motives I listed earlier. So who gives and why they give? There's a few thoughts for you to consider. What about the ethics of giving? And you'll know from the way I've tried to tackle this subject that I don't think that you can consider giving without the reciprocal of receiving. So there's ethics involved in the gift and in the recipient of the gift. I refer to the ethical requirements relating to the duty to give, accepted by individuals widely throughout the world. So the reciprocal, which I'd also like to consider here, are the rules which were given to the ethics of receiving a gift. If you take some concrete situation like a university, what ethical constraints should govern a university in considering whether to accept a gift? Simple initial rule, obviously, is it in accordance with the law? But in modern times, that's not enough. Cambridge had to have an open debate in the congregation when Imperial Tobacco offered, British American Tobacco, offered to fund a chair for one of the humanities, not a science chair. This was considered highly controversial, and it was put to a vote in the university congregation. Of course, all the scientists voted against. The poor old humanities, who don't get big donors very often, voted for, because the chair, I think it was in contemporary politics, had nothing to do with cancer or smoking or anything else. And the majority voted for. But although it was a perfectly lawful thing, it was considered so controversial it had to go to a public vote. So I think the first risk, that apart from lawfulness and legal considerations, is, does it create a conflict of interest? An external funder may seek to impose conditions on the use of his or her gift, and a scholar or scientist who's freely pursuing a line of teaching or research may not want to be tied down by such conditions, and indeed should not be tied down. I think that there's also, when we can pursue this question of a conflict of interest in more detail later if it's of interest, the second consideration is a reputational gift in the public perception of a given transaction. I can't now find the reference, but some years ago, and Jill, you may remember this, in Oxford, there was a major gift from a German foundation which the university accepted. It was perfectly upfront, just publicly announced and so forth. But they decided to give it back because the company that made the gift, or the foundation which made the gift, derived some of its funds from a company which had been involved in the Holocaust.
It was actually an individual.
It was an individual.
Who had allegedly made his money. His grandfather had made the money through slave labour in the 1930s. So,
lawful though it was, that was a consideration of reputational interest of the of the receiving charity, in this case a university, and they gave the money back. Of course, these concerns can arise not only in the case of philanthropic donations from private individuals, or foundations or companies, but equally from financial support in the form of research grants. So there may be some kind of research grants which are not philanthropic, but which in the case of a university you would turn down because of unacceptable conditions. The usual one in the university's case is freedom to publish results, of course. And more substantively, and this is more often the case in ordinary working day things, are the fears that some category of donors, whether they're individuals or representatives of companies, or strong-minded individual philanthropists, will attach conditions that compromise the independence of scholarly or scientific work. We had, and I'm quoting Cambridge cases because I know them best, a foundation wanted to establish a post in Islamic religion. This is some years ago, before all the fuss about Islam and so forth, Salafists. And the representative wanted to have a veto over the appointment of it was a lectureship. The university said no veto. But you're welcome to nominate an observer who can speak but not vote at the appointments board. And that was acceptable to the donor. It was a perfectly reasonable thing. It was a he in this case, he didn't want appointed to his lectureship some fashionable brand of Islamic theology that wasn't in the mainstream. That was his concern. He was not trying to push an angle, he was just wanting to be sure that the university in their unwisdom and ignorance might appoint somebody who didn't know who was an extremist. But so that issue was resolved satisfactorily by all concerned. There's no reason why donors shouldn't express an opinion. You can listen to it, you don't have to accept it. The reputational risk, as we were saying earlier, also arises about, in the case of the source of wealth, can give rise to some practical problems. And again, vetting the source of philanthropic funds is not an easy matter. If individuals made their fortune in industry, is it necessary to consider conditions in their factories to ensure that the profits were ethically earned, no child labour, no slave labour? If so, what level of donation should attract this detailed investigation? If the individual is dead, left a philanthropic foundation, do the same considerations apply? Should the business careers of Carnegie, Rockefeller, Mellon be investigated before applying for grants from the distinguished foundations they established? Well, we've heard from Jill that even where the grandfather made the profits, that may well be a factor which rejects in accepting or rejecting the donation. There's also the argument, as a sometime professional fundraiser, of course, I'm all in favour of having as generous a criterion as possible for the acceptance of gifts, but there's also the argument that even bad money, anyway a tainted concept, should still be considered rather than automatically rejected. Those of you who know the plot of Guys and Dolls will know that betting and wagers came into the business of providing a proper congregation at the mission that the heroine was trying to establish in the New York slum in question. So the question of the source of money, tainted money, applies generally to all charities, though the relevant criteria may differ. For instance, a university might define its criteria for the acceptance of a gift differently from the Salvation Army. I think General Booth in the 19th century was happy to take money from the brewers in his campaign to stamp out drunkenness amongst the East Enders of the day. Similarly, an appeal for famine relief might not have the same criteria that a charity like a university or a hospital might have. So there's room for some intellectual input, thought and decision making about the criteria in these cases. A very contemporary one is, as those of you who read the newspapers, Nigel Farage was criticised recently for accepting European money, despite his objections to the European Union. He replied that, quote, he was taking the devil's money to do the Lord's work. So there you are. You've got a wide range of things, of criteria in which to decide what is the right thing for you or your charity. Plainly, the responsibility for answering such questions and for decisions on the acceptance of a gift rests with the governing body of the charity concerned or the university council. But given to the scale of the effort now being put in by charities in general and the universities in particular, it's not sufficient any longer to rely just on ad hoc decisions and common sense. The scale of investment in fundraising by charities of all kinds is steadily increasing, and common sense, initially a good guide as any, has to be supplemented these days by some kind of more formal guidelines. And most governing bodies have developed not only the guidelines but formal procedures for vetting a gift. They no longer let any old Tom, Dick and Harry in the university go out and raise money for his pet project or her pet project. It's much more systematized, and there are arguments about that too. Why should everything have to go through one central office, fundraising office? Well, this whole process, of course, you will remember, was given renewed emphasis by the saga of the London School of Economics and their links with Gaddafi's Libya. The issues in that case, those of you who remember it will know, the Wolf Report looked into the whole question of the relationship between the university and Libya. Relationship which I may say was encouraged by HMG because we wanted to get various changes in Libyan policy, and universities was a good way in, and the LSE had this connection with Saif Gaddafi, the elder son of Gaddafi. But the result of it was that the various activities which the LSE developed with Libya bore cumulatively on the school's reputation, but nobody knew the full range of what was going on because it was left to individuals to do this and that. Lord Wolf, in his report, was asked to, when he reported on this very painful episode, reached conclusions which were of sufficient importance that when the report was received, the school's director thought it his duty to resign. The details of the link, which, as I say, the British government had encouraged anyway, don't really concern us, but what is important, that the links developed in such a way that the LSE had effectively tied up part of its reputation as that of Libya, I'm quoting Wolf now, and more particularly to Saif Gaddafi. And Lord Wolf's report describes how the relationship developed in a piecemeal fashion, such that there was no overall picture of the various links which departments had with Libya and which had grown up over the years. He concluded that a university should so organise itself that an overview of the activities of the constituent departments, which could have repercussions on a university's work and reputation, is readily available. So the idea that any old member of a university, or a charity for that matter, can go out and raise money anywhere, he frowned on. I think I conclude from this that the sheer size of modern universities, and it applies literally to the big charities, the big national charities too, mean that what once could be dealt with on a basis of common sense and trust now requires a more formal approach. And the need for accepted procedures for reputational risk assessment across an institution is now increasingly accepted. And as I say, the scale of university fundraising makes this only sensible, certainly in the higher education sector. So much for the risks and the ethics, or some of the ethical considerations that may be in your minds. Could we look now at some current modern examples of philanthropy? In particular, I want just to draw your attention to the Giving Pledge launched by Bill Gates and Warren Buffett in 2010. This is not because I neglect the small gifts, the widow's mite, the penny donations in Sheffield and so on, but I think the modern, which will go on anyway, and for reasons which I've already canvassed, but I want to look at the scale of modern philanthropy as we see it in this particular phenomenon. By March 2012, over 100 billionaires, including a few from the UK, had signed up to the pledge, which is a commitment by the world's wealthiest individuals and families to dedicate the majority of their wealth to philanthropy, unquote. These pledges were conservatively estimated in 2013 as worth US $125 billion. In the individual responses, going back to why people would give on this scale, the individual responses explaining individual decisions to give, a number of themes come through. And now I'm quoting from their papers. The wish to give something back, the desire to make a difference, the pleasure and deep fulfillment of philanthropic acts. Another theme, different from these essentially subjective motivations just noted, articulated by Bill Gates in that case, but reflected in many other comments, was how to make philanthropy as impactful as possible. So we're moving away from, giving some money to something that the chairman's wife's favourite charity, to people who are seriously wanting to devote their resources to solving problems. Are they giving on, is it possible for philanthropy to be on such a scale to make this a feasible concept? Well, in the US there were 20 gifts of $100 million cited last year alone. And as I say, the giving pledge itself is worth $125 billion. And along with this phenomenon of major giving, a new vocabulary is coming into vogue. Because the major scale of giving on this huge scale, the donations are less focused on themselves, on the donors, and more focused on problems and results. So they're using in the trade such phrases as impact giving, venture philanthropy, special investing, almost as if these mega donors are looking for techniques somewhere between philanthropy and the market. I'm sure you can all think of examples. I'm thinking of microfinance schemes in India and Africa which have been funded by philanthropists, which are different from aid. It is aid, but it is, as it were, a market-driven process. We are entering a new scale, and when you think of the impact that the collapse of the Soviet Union can have in creating oligarchs with huge funds at their disposal, it isn't just the US where there are these mega dollars available, Middle East, China. It's a global phenomenon. Have I got time just to turn to public policy? And the question has to be asked whether should the state continue to favour such activities through favourable tax treatment of charities for these mega donors. And certainly in the States, as well as in this country and most of Europe, charitable donations attract tax privileges. And the definition of a charity, of course, is a national one, but seems to be getting wider and wider. In this country, no political party has opposed tax privileges, though there was a hiccup, I think you may have noticed or remember, in 2011-12 when a pre-budget paper in the UK canvassed the idea, later withdrawn, of putting a ceiling on the size of gift which could attract favourable tax treatment, as if somebody had started to worry that maybe there was more influence being generated, though the general view is that tax treatment isn't critical in an individual's decision to give away money. After all, in the early 19th and 20th centuries we've spoken of, tax was very low anyway, and people still made lots of philanthropic gifts. Obviously it's a useful encouragement, but there's obviously some anxiety in some people whether the public interest is best served by these favourable tax privileges. I think more fundamental than tax treatment is whether the public interest is best served by the uncoordinated activities of oligarchs and billionaires, random wealthy individuals with bees in their bonnet, rather than by some more coordinated and planned approach through state agencies. But I think we realise that if this is a theoretical choice, who are the people who are going to be running these utopian state agencies which will operate without perversity in disposing of large sums of money? There's unhappily no guarantee that a government agency will be better at analysing the needs of a given problem, and even if they do, will be successful in developing the means to deal with a problem, particularly since some of the direst problems are global and transcend national frontiers. So I hope in this society I don't have to defend the concept that individuals attacking specific problems should not be ruled out. So the modern trend towards aggregated giving, this giving pledge, the Gates malaria program, for instance, is trying to collect a few other billionaires to aggregate a massive resource to tackle a global problem. This trend towards aggregated giving, focusing on a recognised problem, suggests that modern philanthropists are well aware of the issues. Philanthropy on a global scale is needed to have this flexibility to meet the scale of some problems. Nevertheless, there is this tension between, shall we leave it to individuals, how much should the state do, shall we stop individuals, shall we limit in some way the ability to mobilize resources through the tax system, or what? Or are we happy to let the thing run? I've quoted Mrs. Jellyby as not a very inspiring representative of the voluntary sector, but I can quote another Dickens character who supports, as it were, the state approach only. It was Scrooge, of course, and you may recall that when approached on Christmas Eve by some charitable city gents collecting for the poor and destitute who were in want of common comforts, Scrooge asked, "Are there no prisons?" "Plenty of prisons." "And the union workhouses, are they still in operation?" "They are. I wish I could say they were not." "The treadmill and the poor law are in full vigour then?" "Both very busy, sir." "Oh, I was afraid from what you said at first that something had occurred to stop them in their useful course," said Scrooge. "I'm very glad to hear it." Needless to say, he didn't become a donor. So I'm rather artificially making this contrast between the two approaches, but without philanthropy and without individual initiative there would be no voluntary sector, and I can't think that anybody would think that was progress. Indeed, the importance of the voluntary sector in modern society, I think, is growing rather than receding. Governments themselves are increasingly dependent on non-governmental organisations to deliver policies which they don't have the means to implement themselves, whether it's at home or in the aid field abroad. The NGO movement is increasingly important in many countries. Even Mr. Putin recognised their importance. He only banned most of them because he alleged they had become agents of foreign interest. I think I ought to try and sum up. But my conclusions are fairly simple and obvious, that philanthropy is so widespread at all levels of society that it must be considered a deep-seated human instinct, perhaps related to the instinct for self-preservation. Its scope and the growth of institutions to administer charitable funds have nevertheless evolved from a simpler era observable in pre-industrial societies, where, as we saw earlier, the function of an exchange of gifts was to cement social relationships. The widow's mite and the billionaire's pledge are reflections of the bonds that unite members of a social group, whether global in nature or derived from kinship. So I think that despite the difference in scale, human beings have a generous streak. Gift is not a simple act, it creates a relationship which ripples through society, which is why the voluntary principle is so important. However mixed the motives, there is at bottom manifestation of human generosity. But then I'm an optimist.
I'm just wondering, the question that you ask about, can you do good with bad money? I mean, if looking back over your career, can you sort of list the changes that, what the definition of bad money 30 years ago is must be very different from it is today. It's almost like a way of getting inside the heads of philanthropists, or thinking about philanthropy generally, to look at what's defined as good or bad in terms of where the source of the funds.
Well, if you take a Western example like Rockefeller, the first Rockefeller, obviously that charitable foundation was set up as a PR exercise. I think that's generally accepted to change the reputation of the man. But in those days there wasn't the same ready access to information about all the ins and outs of how that fortune was made. And as people say about the Russian oligarchs, okay, you can criticize the first million, but thereafter, once he's got his first million, the rest is normal business. So I don't think you can go on into the history of the funds in any practical way. I don't think that's... What you can do is insist that contemporary donors don't get away with burnishing their reputations through bad practice. And even so, some, as I was arguing, some charities will be less strict than others on that. And some charities, you take some of the religious movements, they not only accept, but willingly accept as a sign of repentance money that's come from. We're into the range of psychoanalysis almost, and I think that the reputational risk is what is the realistic decision criterion for most governing bodies. I don't mean by that if they can get away with it and nobody knows it's okay, but I think they will weigh up whether they really want to be associated. I mean, the joke always was about, would you accept money for the Ceausescu's chair of human rights? Probably you wouldn't.
But you're right about things having changed. I mean, at the University of Bristol, founded by the Wills family, basically, it's based on the sale of cigarettes. Really. That's how they made their huge fortune.
Yeah.
I'm just interested in terms of what's been asked or expected of philanthropists. I'm less interested in what's going on in higher education. I'm more interested in what's happening within the voluntary community sector. And I'm motivated to have that interest by working at the moment with 3 different projects which could be described as unpopular causes. One's recovering alcoholics. Second is adult sex workers, where the project involves some work around exiting prostitution, but quite a lot is focused on the safety of prostitutes, many of whom are victims of domestic violence. And the last one is mentoring ex-offenders. And I'm in discussion with those organisations about where there are philanthropists who are interested in engaging with these types of unpopular causes. I'm conscious that the Prime Minister in his Mansion House speech in November last year talked about continuing austerity for the public sector post any financial crisis, and I just wonder whether whether the expectations that are now placed on philanthropists have got completely out of scale.
I think that question has to be looked at in several ways, but the one that I would look at it from would be the person trying to raise funds for those, if you like, difficult charities without immediate human appeal, generally, as distinct from starving babies, as it were. And I think I would begin by looking at the history of the Terrence Higgins charity, which is 30 or 40 years old now, but at its time was about the most unpopular topic. It wasn't even discussed in polite society anyway. And it is a question of doing research on individual charities and individuals who will take an interest in the problem and to find a way of interesting them in the problem. It's a marketing job. I mean, fundraising is basically marketing, although whatever fuss people make about it as an esoteric skill. Whether it's a university or a charity or a normal charity, you've got to persuade people that it's doing something important that they ought to be supporting. And there's no way around it. I mean, unless, as you say, you won't find politicians keen to fight for unpopular causes like that, like the ones you cite. And the only way to do it is by individual research and meeting people who have the means to help you because they become interested in the problem. How you do it is what you pay consultants and fundraisers for. But I don't think you can look to the public sector, probably not, for funds unless you've found some route.
I think the suggestion is, in terms, say, take the adult sex workers, just about the most unpopular of those causes. Suggestion is that actually there is no alternative to state funding, and yet the climate is one where the ability to access that funding, particularly local authority funding, is incredibly difficult. Where you see examples like the Barnet grant of Do, which did the rounds of the Cabinet Office saying, local authority, Barnet, several years' time, the only thing we'll be able to fund is most serious child protection cases and the most extreme cases in terms of adult social care. We won't even be able to deliver anything else. Cuts the floor from those charities. And in a sense, it's about how do you get realism about that discussion about philanthropists. I can understand how philanthropists can get engaged with different aspects of what a university or a higher education institution might do. But actually it's creeping, there are some different expectations creeping over into the voluntary sector, which may be actually quite unhelpful over the top.
Yes, it reflects the same what happened to the lottery, the early days of the lottery, isn't it? Where they reorganised in order to get rid of grants to the unpopular subjects. That was considered to be, held it against their freedom to make decisions on who to fund. So, yeah. What else?
Bill, I liked your description of the really fundamental issue, in a sense, certainly in this country after World War II, of whether a socialist state should raise a lot of taxes and make political decisions about how those taxes should be spent to better society, or more along the American model, whether individuals should have much more choice about where their money should go, as it were. I mean, there's no question here that, of course, the UK Treasury, interestingly, not just the politicians, but played a very, very strong role in in pushing for control, Treasury control has been quite phenomenal here. And that's civil servants as a matter of fact, not politicians. I agree with you. I think that things are easing up now much more. I mean, focus on the recent UK inheritance law that is now going to allow huge tax relief on wills that leave more than 10% to charities. That would have been unheard of 50 years ago. Very interesting debate there.
Well, I think the issue is how to get more resources into these needs of society. To some degree, they have to be funded by the state. You've mentioned small ones which ought to be funded by the state. We all agree about the National Health Service. There's controversy about the smaller unpopular ones. But how do we get resources in? The main thing is we've got to explore any avenue we can, whether it's philanthropy or state or local. I mean, at the end of the day, it depends on the standards in the society in which you live. I mean, we complain about the state of our prisons. The Majesty's Inspector of Prisons was talking about the disgraceful state. But you consider the state of Russian prisons as defined in some of the voluntary sector reports coming out of Russia. But they're reflecting the standards of a different society. And if our society is tolerant of child abusers and so forth, then we will get child abuse. So it isn't just resources, I'm afraid, to say this, but I think you've got to, you can look at umpteen examples around the world of where societies are not delivering what they should be delivering to their people.
So I'm wondering as well about the whole nature of receiving a gift. I mean, I recently read a kind of case study about the Shell Foundation, which was funding kind of in collaboration with other NGOs. They were funding this sort of project to create effective solid fuel cooking stoves for use in poor countries where there weren't any alternatives. The idea was effectively, and they'd invested quite a lot of thought in how to approach the project. You know, then they weren't going to have just one model. It was going to be locally based, you know, the kind of fuel that people use and how they use it. But the key issue there was their kind of decision based on their research not to give these stoves away, not to make a charitable donation of the stoves, but effectively to ask people to pay something for them, on the grounds that if people had paid something for them, they would use them, because they had a history of previous projects where they handed out stoves and then nobody used them. And there's some sort of sense, I mean, a sense that of payment, you know, that somehow there might just be something ineffective about a charitable gift, that because it's a gift, people don't respect it as much as something they pay for. I don't know whether it's just because everything is now becoming monetarized and marketized, or whether there's some sort of underlying something going on there that we need to think about.
Well, I think there's no doubt if you harness human aspirations, you will get progress. I mean, I remember the time after the war when nobody had a fridge. Anybody who could afford a fridge, people would go around and look at it. And the same with the television in the 50s. And people were motivated to get a fridge and a TV. And isn't that just a human instinct? I've got a fridge, you know. I've got a stove. I've got one of these new lavatories. Other people then will, you know, you're harnessing a very strong motivation, which, as you say, I think you don't get from a gift. That doesn't mean to say that there should be no public good available, that we should close all the public libraries and pay for everything and shut the museums. But, you know, if you can harness it, but, you know, I'm out of my league here because this is very motivational, so how you get... But I think this is what some of these tycoons are groping for. They're looking for something between philanthropy and the market, as I was saying earlier, but which is essentially funded by philanthropy, and within the scope of per person.
There's a sense, isn't there, if you lay out some of your own money, however small, it's a pretty clear indication that you've made a decision that you actually want to acquire what is being offered. There's no question about that. You're not going to pay for something. You're rarely going to pay for something you don't really want, especially if money is very tight. Too often, I think, philanthropic aid activities have decided what they think people want and have provided them as gifts without people actually, the people who receive them, haven't expressed any interest or need for these things. I don't think it's necessary for payment to enter into this, but it's the approach which actually makes sure that what you're responding to is expressed needs rather than the expert NGO worker who knows best what people should be given. That's where money can be wasted.
You mentioned the microfinance, the granting bank.
Yeah.
Okay. That's a classic case.
Yeah.
It's very, very successful.
Very successful.
Rates are extraordinarily high.
Yeah, well.
The government's now trying to put it out of business. It's so successful.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, back. Yeah.
Yes, you mentioned the idea of duties considerably, but say very little about rights. And rights and duties are they not co-relative? And if someone's got duties, then someone else has got a right to whatever it is you have a duty to give, and vice versa. And that raises the question of where do the duties of donors stop? Do they stop at the moment you chuck your money in the bucket? Or do they continue through to what that money is used for and whether it's successful or not?
Well, I think it's a very important question. You're absolutely right. I didn't pursue it because I don't know enough about it. I think we're in the realm of Kant and moral imperatives. And as I think I said, your duty to your neighbour or to a distant stranger, it was very hotly disputed. And I think distant strangers won't get much shrift in this country at the moment, for instance. And yet there is a moral imperative which we express vicariously through the aid programme to help a distant stranger, even though India has nuclear weaponry developed by the state, we still give it money. So, this is a very important question. You've put your finger on a very important aspect which I haven't developed at all, but I think it should be in everybody's mind.
Yes.
I've got a question about foreign aid. It's been described as like poor people in the giving countries or the first world because they pay for it through taxation and aid program. But in the recipient country, it goes to not to the poor people in that country, but more to the rich people in that country who cream it off. So the question is really, could you say a bit about the level of corruption and whether it's state aid or private philanthropy that, if you like, cuts a better deal for the people, the poor people in that third world countries?
I think it's generally accepted that NGOs do a better job because they're closer to the issues than governments do, and a lot of our NGOs try and work direct with the recipient rather than going through a governmental outfit in a third country. But I think public policy in third countries doesn't always allow you to do that, and I think Russia was a case in point. But other countries don't like being typed as we can't spend your money without corruption, which is really what you're saying to them. I don't know if anybody has experience in third world.
Well, last time works for DFID, and lots of different money actually goes through
NGOs, yes, that's right. Because they're more effective in getting it to the recipient.
His role is impact research, because that's the big thing.
Yeah.
Because of the Daily Mail, because backbench stories, things that make money is going to corrupt politicians.
Yes.
So it's very political work.
I think the point you make about overseas aid is taking money from poor people in rich countries to give to rich people in poor countries is an argument for the anti-aid lobby, and that's a big political issue anyway. It's like missionary work for the church. We send missionaries abroad. Well, they ought to be sending missionaries to us, sort of idea. But I think that's so political that all parties, I think, still believe in foreign aid, and that seems to be the general view of the country at large.
I was more asking really about the corruption issue and the bribe.
Well, I think
Nigeria, Pakistan.
It's so easy to transfer money. I mean, okay, we had corrupt societies in the 18th, 17th, and any century you care to mention, but we had to spend that corrupt money in our own country because it wasn't so easy. You didn't have a plastic card and you take your American Express card and spend it anywhere you like, or open a Swiss bank account. You had to, so that even though it was obtained corruptly, you built it, you used it to build a palace in the country, and you used English masons and local cement and stuff. So the money went into the economy. Well, in a sense, if I corruptly get a contract for a bridge by paying the minister a sum and then build a perfectly good bridge, I don't think that's too bad. If I get corruptly a contract to build a bridge and build a bridge that falls down, that's where I think we
Or a bridge that's not built at all.
Or not built at all. No, I know. Look at Iraq. Well, you can name your favourite example. There are plenty of them.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. It was a great talk. You listed a whole lot of the different types of motivations, donor motivations, and I was wondering, from your own experience as a fundraiser working with some of the largest donors to this country, to the university sector, I mean, which of those motivations, those triggers for action, stood out as being the most important, like the first, the top 1, 2, or 3? Did any stand out?
Yes, I think there are. I think the first one, I think, is the excitement which an expert generates in the mind of a rich man or woman. It could be a doctor, it could be an aid worker, it could be an academic piece of work. But it's that personal impact on an individual which excites him. And that's why fundraising has to be led by the people who are doing the job and not by fundraisers. Because it is that excitement. You feel you're connected with somebody who's, and in the case of universities, people are really impressed to get to meet professors and scientists and people, and often it is the scientists. So you think of the cancer charities, how good they are. They have coffee parties where people show you how to make DNA in a test tube, and you go into a lab and see a youngster working on, it's terrifically motivational. So I put that as top, the impact of a person doing a job to complete or tackle a problem which you think is important. I think the second one is wanting to give something back. After all, I am anyway, of a generation which paid nothing for my education. So you really feel you have to put something back into the pot, and a lot of people feel that. I think that's the second most motivational one. And then you get on to the, not the 7 deadly sins exactly, but the sort of more selfish things like being associated with a prestigious activity or institution, whatever it is, whether it's a hospital or the National Trust or universities. I would put those three, personal vanity in other words. So.
These are very obvious points. I just wonder about the role of loyalty to institutions. I mean, surely if people give to Oxford and Cambridge because they loved Oxford and Cambridge, and they identify it, or Imperial College or wherever. And also the other thing, like sort of love thing, why do people give to donkey sanctuaries? Because they love donkeys. Why do they give to Battersea Dog Sanctuary? Because they love dogs. I mean, do you think this is very significant, or am I off on that tangent as well?
I think the idea of loving your university is not very common in my experience, actually. Many people had painful experiences at their university and didn't like the department, read the wrong subject, were not looked after by the professors, etc. So, so that's, but I think donkeys, I mean, I knew a woman who ran a donkey secretary, and this was in the war, and she was still buying silk stockings for the donkeys to keep the flies off in the summer. How do you explain that? I can't explain it, except people have feelings, and you can't get into philanthropy without having regard to the emotional side of things. It's a point I tried to make there, because I think philanthropy and the whole thing of a gift relationship is emotional as well as practical.
I'm just a bit surprised about what you said about universities, because in America, I mean, the alumni give enormous sums to the universities. I mean, surely they hate the university.
Yeah, I don't want to exaggerate it, but I mean, Cambridge, I don't know about others, get a significant amount of money from people who never went to a university. And in some cases, they get more from people who never went, but who want to be associated, than from their own folk, as it were. I think the giving rate by alumni, the last figure I saw was in the Pierce report, which some of you might know, which I said something like 3% of all students give money to their university. But obviously that's from a very low base. John, you may remember the Pierce report figure, but it's something very low, because they're saying in 10 years' time, if we all work very hard, we might get up to 10%. So that's 90% who are not giving. But that may be because higher education is not in their list of charities that they support, not that they're not being charitable.
But it strikes me, just thinking about the American and UK differences in philanthropic giving, that it was a very interesting piece written about a decade ago now by Karen Wright from the LSE, and on the role of giving in the US being seen as it's a civic responsibility, that at every stage in your life you are, so you give to your children's school, to your church, to your former school, and to other activities and science engagement. It's a civic expectation. Then looking at the UK, or the Great UK, that the decision to give is seen much more as, is framed as an individualistic choice, and therefore you also then have greater generosity to a wider range of causes, including international causes. So it's also there's the cultural, I think, dimension that's put on top of giving as well.
And the tax regime is designed to encourage that.
I'd add one more thing about the American giving to higher education. I'll come back to the other point in a second. They do have something which they call heritage giving, which means that if you have a relationship with your university, your son or your daughter is given special consideration over admission. Now, I don't think that would work in this country somehow. The other thing is that a lot of people, and if you like, my generation anyway, certainly regarded university education as a public good, like going to school. So why should we pay for it? And it's required a huge effort by university leadership to explain why they need private support as well as the taxpayer support. And look at all the argument about university fees. People are still thinking that this ought to be free, some people.
I think there's other incentives as well in America to give to American universities. The only people I know of who I graduated with who give back to my undergraduate university do so in order to get football tickets. Because you have to give a certain amount.
To get what, sorry?
Football tickets.
Yeah.
So
Football.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
So
sure.
like American football.
Yeah, okay, fine.
So I went to a school that has a really good football team, and in order to be on the list for alumni tickets, you have to give over a certain amount every year. So things like that, and the special consideration as well. But
Yeah.
no, I mean, nobody who just went who doesn't care about football is going to give unless you end up getting a very good job, because you kind of feel like, well, I've already given you so much money.
Yeah, sure.
Until I get a job in which I can theoretically say, okay, you did me some good, I'm not going to give you any money.
I suppose the fundraising in American universities has been pretty well organized for a very long time. It may be that I was still being pursued many years after I graduated by, I just received the Wittenberg magazine. It was all full of, stories, and then you look at the back of it, and it's you see the sort of names, someone has gotten married, and then they list both parents were graduates, the grandparents were graduates, their children are going to be graduates. There is this kind of continuing relationship, and also with givers, families who've given a building, sometimes their children will give another building,
That's right.
And I mean, I always associate giving in American universities with buildings for some
But
reason.
again, you're not going to, the majority, 99.9% of people do not have enough money to give a building. That's going to be the, people who probably inherited most of their money anyway, rather than got it directly from school.
I always had a jaundiced view of it, really, because the one thing that was really new and big was the football stadium. And I remember the history department was in some kind of hideous underground slum, and I began to think that charitable giving wasn't such a great thing.
Well, doesn't the football coach get more money than the president
Probably.
of the university? I mean,
I'll bet, yeah. Yeah.
Easily.
we haven't reached that point yet. Hence our exit from the World Cup.
Anybody else?
One of the subject of buildings, but not in universities. Years ago, I went to Community Links, the now quite famous organisation in Europe. And at that stage, nearly every room was named after a local business in recognition of the fact they'd given money. And at the time I went, you could just about go around and say, well, that business is now been taken over, that one's gone bust. This one doesn't exist anymore. Well, they had their moment of fleeting fame, but it's all gone.
That's a very depressing way of ending this. Any more questions? Otherwise, I will thank our speaker again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I enjoyed it.
Really enjoyed it.